This is the long-awaited Sony A7 Mark IV. It has a lovely new 33 megapixel full-frame BSI sensor, which they claim will give you 15 stops of dynamic range. It has nearly the same physical design as the A7S Mark III, with the dual card slots, the flip-out screen, the 5.5 stops stabilized sensor, the new 10-bit codecs in either intraframe or long op, and the new and improved color science from the latest alpha cameras like the A7S Mark III, A1, and of course the cinema line. This is a huge upgrade from the Mark III version and could quite quickly become the go-to hybrid mirrorless camera from Sony. But I think it's important when discussing the A7 Mark IV to keep in mind what it is and what it isn't trying to be. This is Sony's regular A7 camera, not the A7S, not the A7R, and certainly not the A1. The idea here isn't to be the best in any one particular area. Instead, Sony will have been trying to hit that sweet spot in the middle, the jack of all trades option, the camera for people who do a wide variety of work rather than specializing in any particular area. And of course, trying to do all of that at a reasonable price point. To me, this is the starting point when you're looking at Sony's mirrorless lineup. Start here, figure out if this will do the job for you or not, and if you need more video features and low light, go to the A7S, need more resolution, go to the A7R, need speed, go to the A9, and if you need more of everything all at once, go to the A1. So, as always on this channel, we'll be mainly focusing on the video features of the camera, and the headline spec here is definitely the 4K full frame video, which is downsampled from a 33 megapixel 7K sensor. Just like we saw when Sony used a similar kind of idea in the A1, this results in a really detailed and clean image. We put it side by side with the A7 III and the A7S III, and it is definitely more detailed and cleaner at normal ISO levels. It's close to the A7S III, not day and night better, but there is more detail there. It's also probably where the increase in dynamic range that Sony talk about comes from as well, as it definitely helps clean up some of the noise in the shadows. We get Sony's new video codecs, which are a big improvement over what you can get in the A7 III. Just like the A7S III, you can choose from XAVC-SI, XAVC-HS, and XAVC-S, with 10-bit 42 and 420 options. There's no recording limit, and for media, we get dual SD card slots. Now, interestingly, one of these card slots is the dual SD card and CF Express Type A slot that we've seen on the A7S Mark III. Now, I assume the reason for only having one of these as this dual slot is to keep production costs down and therefore keep the cost of the camera down, which I can't say I blame Sony for. I think most A7 IV owners will end up using SD cards anyway, but it is nice that you can still use CF Express cards in one of the slots if you're already invested in them. It means if you have an A7S Mark III system already and you have those cards and you want the A7 IV as a B camera maybe, you can just use the same media. Now, frame rate is one of the areas which I think could be a disappointment for people used to the A7S Mark III and similar cameras. This is where we start to see the trade-offs happening in order to keep the cost lower and improve the stills side of the camera. Full frame 4K is only up to 30 frames a second. You can go to 60p in 4K, but you have to crop into Super 35mm mode. In 1080p, you can get up to 120 frames a second. As I said, these lower frames a second are the trade-off for having that downsampling. But of course, the downsampling comes with a lot of benefits. As we've already seen, it gives us a very detailed image and a much lower noise floor. But it also means the camera performs really quite well at higher ISO values. Just like we saw with the A1, the A7 IV actually outperforms the low light focused A7S Mark III at most of the regular day-to-day ISO values. You really have to get up to about sort of 10,000 ISO maybe for the A7S Mark III to start taking over and starting to shine. This is because the downsampling is cleaning up that noise beautifully. It also means the camera does really well in this dynamic range test, With this underlit subject in front of a bright window, you can see the A7 III is really falling apart here because of that compressed 8-bit codec, and both the A7S Mark III and the A7 IV do very well. But the A7 IV is slightly more detailed and cleaner. So where does this now leave us? Well, let's start comparing the new Mark IV directly to the previous model, the A7 III, and of course the newer A7S Mark III. And if you put it directly up against the previous Mark III version, it is just a clear improvement in pretty much every area. There's a big stills resolution bump from 24 to 33 megapixels, of course, but the real difference is in its video features. The A7 Mark III still uses Sony's very compressed XAVC-S 8-bit codec. The new XAVC-SI and HS codecs are a significant improvement. You get 10 bits, you get a choice of all-eye, long-op or H.265 for different workflows, and you get higher data rates for a less compressed image when you want it. It's much better quality, the pictures look much better, it's just a day and night improvement, and of course a much more professional workflow on the A7S Mark III and the A7 Mark IV. Physically, we have a lot of changes here as well. We now get a full-size HDMI port, this new dial to change between video and stills modes quickly, which I love, and all the physical buttons as a whole are just much better quality now. We also of course get the option to use CF Express cards if you want to, even if it is only on that one card slot. The new menu system as well is much quicker to use than it was on the A7 Mark III, and the colours are much better as well in my opinion, especially now we've got the addition of S-Cinetone for quick turnaround work. If you're looking to pick up an A7 camera, my advice is definitely go for the Mark IV now over the Mark III. Now, when we put it side by side with the A7S Mark III, things get much more interesting. The A7S sits at a higher price point, but it is a more premium product in many ways. The most obvious area that shows this is the viewfinder. The A7S Mark III has the same viewfinder as the flagship A1, and it's the best viewfinder I have ever used on a mirrorless camera. It's 9.44 million dots, while the A7 IV is 3.69 million, which is a big difference and it does show when you're using it. The A7 viewfinder is perfectly fine, it does the job perfectly well, but the A7S1 is clearly better. Frame rates are the other big area where the A7S wins out. On the A7 IV, you can only get up to 4K 30p with the full sensor or 120p in 1080. You do get 4K 50 and 60, but only when you crop into Super 35mm mode. On the A7S III, you can do up to 4K 120 or 1080 240 with the full sensor width. There are lots of similarities between the two cameras as well. The menu structure is the same and both take the same kinds of media. The physical design as a whole is very similar as well, and the stabilization looks to be the exact same system. There is a big difference though in the HDMI ports. Both are full-size HDMI, which is excellent, but the A7S Mark III can turn this into a 16-bit RAW output so that you can record ProRes RAW on an Atomos Ninja 5. The A7 IV can't do that. So overall, I am just hugely impressed with the A7 Mark IV. I mean, is this groundbreaking new camera technology? No, not really. But that's not what this camera is about, so I was never expecting it to be. This is a hugely sensible and practical option. It's a jack of all trades camera, and I think it will be very popular with a lot of people. The big question, of course, is will the A7 IV be enough for you and for your work? Or will you need to upgrade? I guess there's a few big questions you're going to need to ask yourself in order to make that decision. Firstly, how often do you need to take stills with this camera? And what are those stills used for? I mean, the 12 megapixel stills from the A7S look great, but they're still only 12 megapixels, which is pretty low by modern standards. The 33 megapixel files from the A7 IV look much better. Then from a video point of view, you have to look at what kind of work you do. If you need high frame rates for some slow motion and you need that extreme low light performance, the A7S Mark III is the clear choice. But for real-time recording, the A7S Mark IV is just as good, if not a bit better when recording internally because of that increased detail coming from the downsampled sensor. There are, of course, 100 different pros and cons either way, And if you want more personalized advice for you specifically, just get in touch with Proav and come and talk to one of our technical specialists. But for most people, it might just be as simple as this. If you need a hybrid camera and you don't have the budget for an A1, get the A7 Mark IV. If you need a video-specific mirrorless camera, or you do a lot of slow motion work, get the A7S Mark III. Now that is, of course, a massive oversimplification, but hopefully that helps. If you have any questions on the A7 Mark IV at all, just let us know in the comment section. And if you want to buy one for your own work, of course, head over to proav.co.uk. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.